Hunger isn't a crime. It's a cry. And on Calhoun 3, no one had the energy left to answer it. The sun hadn't fully set, but the sky was already fading into that bruised shade between gold and rust. Winds swept across the brittle farmland like whispered warnings, stirring up thin trails of ochre dust that clung to skin and lashes. Even the crops, those stubborn stalks grown through relentless drought and ration water, seemed to sag with exhaustion. Frank Hale stood on the edge of his plot, the handle of his old iron shovel resting against one shoulder. He squinted toward the tree line beyond the eastern fence, eyes narrowed under the wide brim of his sun-worn hat. Something was moving between the rows. At first, he thought it was a forger dog, wild, maybe wounded. They'd been known to sneak on private farms in the dry season, desperate for scraps. But no, this was different. Too smooth, too upright. A slender shape weaving low through the dust-hardened furrows, limbs wrapped tight around someone. He moved slowly at first, more curious than concerned, until the figure stopped at one of his side sheds, the storage bin where he kept vegetable scraps and bread too stale for even barter. It was supposed to be locked. Frank's pace quickened. He rounded the corner just in time to see her. She wasn't human, not even close. Her skin was a muted green, dry and almost cracked like sun-scorched jade. Long strands of white hair fell around her face in uneven waves, and her thin eyebrows, also white, arched sharply over narrow eyes that gleamed in the twilight. Silver markings trailed down her temples in fading lines, like dried rivers on a cracked map. In one arm, she held a canvas sack stuffed with roots, carrots, bread heels. In the other, a child. The girl was small, no older than 5, blue-skinned, with stark white hair braided into a tight crown and the same snow-colored brows that made her wide eyes look impossibly large. She clung to the woman's neck with silent desperation. They locked eyes, Frank and the woman, just for a second, but it was long enough. She froze. Her jaw tightened, and then she ran. Frank stepped forward instinctively. His hand tightened on the shovel, not to strike, just to brace. He wasn't even sure what he'd do, but he'd seen too many desperate shapes dash into the dusk and never come back. And this one carried a child. She didn't get far. Her left leg buckled as she pushed herself past the edge of the fence. She stumbled, caught herself for a heartbeat, then fell hard onto one side. The sack burst open, vegetables scattering in every direction. Dust kicked up around them, but her arms never let go of the girl. Frank approached carefully. The shovel hung loosely now, forgotten in his grip. He watched her try to push herself up again and fail. Her breathing was labored. One leg was bent at an unnatural angle, a swelling visible just beneath the makeshift cloth binding. Infection, days old, maybe more. Her forehead glistened despite the dry air. Fever. She didn't look at him. Instead, she turned her face to the red-tinged sky above them, her lips barely parting. "Please," she whispered. Her voice was raw, her accent thick but gentle. "My child is hungry." The words weren't for him. They were sent skyward. A prayer, or maybe just the last exhale of hope. Frank dropped the shovel. He stepped closer. The girl was staring up at him now, face dirt-streaked and still. She didn't speak, didn't cry, just watched. Her small hands trembled slightly as she tightened her grip around her mother's collar. The woman was too far gone to resist. Her skin burned under his touch when he crouched and slid one arm beneath her back, the other beneath her legs. She was terrifyingly light, like someone carved from dry reeds and bone. He expected her to flinch, to jerk away, but she didn't. She just went limp in his hold. But when he stood, something shifted. The little girl gasped sharply. Her eyes locked onto his arms, wide with panic, and she lunged forward, grabbing onto the hem of her mother's shawl, pulling with all her small strength. "No," she cried. "Don't take her." Frank froze. "I'm not," he said, steady and low. "She's hurt. She needs help. You can come with me." The girl didn't let go. Her lips trembled, and her voice broke as she spoke again, barely more than a breath. "You're gonna lock her up, like the others." Frank blinked. "The others?" She nodded once, fiercely. She said humans take people, Put them in fences. He crouched slightly, careful not to drop the woman. Not me. I don't have a fence. The girl didn't believe him. Not yet. He took one step back toward the farmhouse. You stay with her. You hold her hand the whole way. No one's taking her away. The girl hesitated just a second, but it was enough. She reached down, grabbed her mother's limp hand, and clung to it like a lifeline. The shawl dragged in the dirt behind them as she followed, step by trembling step. He led them across the field in silence, past the wind-rattled greenhouse, across the cracked path where no grass had grown in 3 years, toward the only structure for miles that still had a light on. They didn't speak. None of them. Not until he reached the front steps of his cabin, the solar light flickering weakly in the wind above the door. He turned to check if the girl was still with him. She was, and she finally spoke. She didn't want to steal, she said softly. Her voice was high but steady. She only did it 'cause I said I was hungry. Frank nodded. He didn't ask her name, didn't tell her not to worry, just said, I know, and held the door open. Inside, the warmth from the reclaimed solar heater hit them like a second shock. The cabin wasn't much, 2 rooms, a water basin, 1 cot, 1 table, but it was clean, and more importantly, it was safe. Frank laid the woman on the cot. Her breath came in shallow pulls now, and when he brushed her hair from her face to check her temperature again, she stirred just barely, eyes fluttering, lips moving without sound. He turned to the girl. Sit, he said. He set bread and root slices on a chipped plate, handed it to her, and turned back to boil water for the woman's cloth bandage. The girl sat cross-legged on the floor beside the bed. She didn't eat right away. She looked at the food for a long moment, then whispered toward her mother. Mama, can I eat now? Her mother didn't answer. The girl picked up a piece of bread, cradled it in both hands, and took the tiniest bite. Frank kept his eyes on the water. He didn't speak again, but inside his chest, something stirred. How many had come before? How many refugees had crept across the line, stealing into fields like shadows, leaving nothing but footprints and fear behind? Most ran when he saw them. Some begged. None carried a child. He'd once had a daughter. A long time ago, before the sickness, before the colony guards turned the gates inward and the worlds got smaller. He hadn't meant to care again, but here he was, heating water, tending wounds, letting strangers inside his walls. The woman stirred again. Her eyelids twitched. Her lips parted. And this time, he heard her clearly. Don't take her. Frank looked down at her, at the lines of faded silver running down her face. Ancient tattoos, perhaps, though faded like forgotten scripture. She's safe, he said. You both are. For now. She didn't answer, but the girl leaned against the bed, her cheek to her mother's arm, and whispered, as if the words alone might keep the room from collapsing. We're not bad people. We're just hungry. Frank turned down the light. He didn't say it aloud, but the words echoed through him, as steady and clear as a vow. So am I, kid. Just a different kind of hungry. He stepped outside, into the night wind, staring out across his field of hollow crops and dust. He didn't know who they were. He didn't know what would come next. But he'd crossed a line, and with every step away from that shed, he knew. Whatever he carried in his arms back there, it wasn't just a body. It was the beginning of something he couldn't set down. The woman hadn't moved in hours. She lay still on Frank's cot, one arm curled loosely toward her chest, the other hanging off the edge like it had forgotten it was part of her. Sweat clung to her temples, darkening her silver markings, while her long white hair spilled in tangled waves across the pillow. Even in sleep, her brow remained furrowed, as if her body refused to let go of fear, even for a moment. The girl sat on the floor beside her, knees drawn to her chest, tiny fingers picking at the hem of her dress. She hadn't spoken since asking for permission to eat. Hadn't touched the bread again, either. Frank watched from across the room, leaning against the counter with a half-clean dish in one hand and a faded towel in the other. He hadn't asked their names. He didn't need to. Names came later. What mattered now was simple. The woman needed rest, and the girl needed safety. For tonight, they had both. Still, the silence pressed on him like weight. Outside, the winds had settled. The sky had deepened into a starless dark, the kind of quiet night Calhoun 3 offered after the heat had burned itself out. But inside the cabin, there was still a storm, quiet, coiled beneath the surface, waiting to break. Frank cleared his throat softly, breaking the stillness. "You want more food?" The girl looked up. Blue skin shimmered faintly under the cabin's dim yellow lights. Her white eyebrows arched in something like confusion, or maybe caution. She shook her head. "She only eats after I do," came a voice from the bed. Weak, rasping. The woman's eyes were still closed, but her lips had moved. Frank turned. "I feed her first," she whispered again. "Then if there's enough." Her voice faded into the pillow. Frank set down the dish and crossed the room. "There's enough. You need to eat too." The woman stirred slightly, cracking open one eye. Up close, her face was thinner than he'd thought. Not just malnourished, depleted. Like something had been drained from her long before she collapsed in his field. He pulled the stool closer to the bed and sat down, leaving just enough distance to avoid crowding her. "You're not in the camps anymore," he said. "This isn't a guard station. You don't have to ration fear." She didn't respond. Her gaze drifted across the ceiling, then toward her daughter. "She's Aniva," the girl said suddenly. "That's her name." Frank turned toward the child. "She doesn't like saying it out loud. She thinks people won't say it right." Aniva flinched. "I can try," Frank said gently. "Aniva." The woman's lips twitched. It could have been a wince or something softer. "I'm Frank." The girl gave a tiny nod. Then, after a long pause, "I'm Sura." "Sura," he repeated. "Nice to meet you." Another silence fell, but this one was thinner, less heavy. He stood and walked over to the cupboard. There wasn't much in the way of comfort food, but he managed to scrape together a bowl of soft root mash and reheated grain flatbread. He brought it back, set it on the table near the bed, and stepped away again. "I'll leave this here." "No rush." Sura watched the food, her eyes flicking from it to her mother, then back again. Frank returned to the counter and picked up the dish towel again. He wasn't good at this. Never had been. Hospitality had never been his strength. At least, not since his daughter's laughter stopped echoing in these walls. He busied himself with work he didn't need to do, scrubbing dishes that were already clean, wiping surfaces that hadn't seen dust in days. But his mind wandered. To the camps. To the quiet rumors that filtered in from other settlers. Aliens dying off by the dozens, diseases, starvation, unsanctioned raids. Most folks didn't talk about it unless it affected trade. Compassion had become a luxury. Still, he couldn't forget how light Aniva had been in his arms. How close she'd come to not making it. And the way Sura had refused to let go. That grip had stayed with him. Behind him, he heard the subtle shift of cloth. Aniva was sitting up, slowly. One hand braced against the edge of the bed, the other pressed to her side. Her legs dangled off the mattress, and she looked pale under the cabin lights, more ghost than flesh. But she was upright. "Easy," Frank said without turning. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice cracked around the words. He didn't argue. He just grabbed a metal cup, filled it with cool water, and brought it over. Aniva accepted it with both hands. She drank slowly, lips barely touching the rim. Frank waited. "I'm not staying long," she said after a moment, voice firmer now. "Just until she sleeps." Frank glanced towards Sura, who had already curled up beside the bed, her small body half asleep and half alert, head resting against the side of the mattress. "Stay as long as you need," he said. Aniva stared at him. Her eyes were unreadable, glassy, distant. "Why?" He didn't flinch. "Because I've watched too many people turn away. It doesn't mean I have to." Her mouth pressed into a line. "You don't know what I am. You're someone's mother." That stopped her. The words hung there, suspended in the dim space between them. She looked down at her hands, at the silver tray skin that had once meant something, perhaps rank, perhaps devotion, and now looked more like a warning. Finally, she said, "We're carrion. From the old colony belt. We weren't supposed to come here." "Plenty of people aren't supposed to be anywhere," Frank replied. Aniva studied him again, this time not with suspicion, but something closer to disbelief. "You're not afraid?" He gave a slow shake of his head. "Not of you." For a long time, neither of them said a word. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the shutters. Inside, the warmth held. Aniva looked toward the plate of food. then to her daughter. Sura's eyes were closed now. Her chest rose and fell in soft, shallow breaths. A child deep in the kind of sleep that only comes after days of silence, fear, and exhaustion. Aniva stood slowly, wincing as weight returned to her leg. Frank reached out instinctively, but she held up a hand, not in hostility, but pride. "I can walk," she said. He stepped back. She took the plate and moved to sit beside her daughter. Then, gently, she broke the flatbread in two. Half for herself, half for Sura, just in case the girl woke. She ate quietly, carefully, as if afraid she'd forget how. Frank didn't interrupt. The scene didn't need commentary. She ate until the plate was empty, then placed it aside. Sura hadn't stirred. Aniva ran her fingers through the girl's white hair, smoothing it back from her brow. Her expression softened, something fragile, private, a piece of her that hadn't shown since the moment she collapsed in his field. Frank turned away and moved toward the door. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Nowhere," he said. "Just giving you both a room." She didn't answer, but when he paused at the door and looked back one last time, he saw it. Her body no longer rigid. Her shoulders finally starting to drop, and Sura's hand curled gently over her mother's. The silence between them had changed. Not broken, but thinned. Morning light came slowly to Calhoun 3, diffused through the red-gold haze of dust that hung in the sky like a permanent bruise. It seeped into Frank's cabin through the narrow slats in the shutters, painting thin stripes across the wooden floor. The wind had eased overnight, leaving behind a strange stillness, like the land itself was waiting to exhale. Frank was already up. He hadn't slept much, just enough to keep the ache in his back from settling too deep. He stood at the small basin near the hearth, rinsing his hands in cool water as the solar heater hummed behind him, faint and steady. The cabin smelled of warm grain, faint antiseptic, and the old wood smoke that clung to everything, even years after he'd stopped burning logs. Behind him, the room was quiet. Then soft footsteps, the tap of small feet on bare floorboards. Sura. She padded into the kitchen space like a child used to being unnoticed. Her white hair was tangled from sleep, and she rubbed her eyes with the back of one hand before climbing onto a stool near the table. She didn't speak, just looked around, blinking slowly, as if making sure it all hadn't disappeared overnight. Frank glanced at her over his shoulder. "You sleep all right?" She nodded. "It's warm here. Warm's not always easy to come by." Sura looked down at her feet. "Mama says warmth is a luxury, that it makes you weak if you trust it." Frank dried his hands on a faded towel and set it aside. "Your mama's not wrong, but sometimes weak is better than cold." She didn't smile, but her shoulders eased a little. A rustle came from the cot in the other room, barely audible, but both of them heard it. Aniva hadn't fully woken yet, but her body was beginning to stir under the blankets. Sura's attention snapped toward the sound like a magnet. Frank watched the change in her posture, alert, protective, maybe even afraid. "She's still tired," he said gently. "She needs time." Sura nodded again, but didn't move. Her small hands rested on the edge of the table, fingers twitching like she wanted to do something. Then, suddenly, she slid down from the stool and walked to the wall near the fireplace, where a few stray lumps of charcoal sat next to kindling. Without asking, she picked one up and began to draw on the wall. Frank said nothing. He didn't need to. The walls of this house had carried worse. At first it was just shapes, circles, swirls, long lines. But quickly, the images took form. A starship, a tent, two figures, one tall, one small, holding hands. The smaller one had a bright white crown etched into her head. He knelt nearby, not to interrupt, but just to watch. "You draw a lot?" he asked. Sura nodded without pausing. "When we stay in places longer than a day, I remember things better if I draw them." Frank let his gaze linger on the newest image. The tall figure, the mother, had a faint halo around her head. It wasn't religious. It looked more like distance, reverence, maybe grief. "Is that her?" he asked. Sura looked at it. "That's when she used to sing." Frank raised an eyebrow. "She doesn't anymore? Only when I'm sick, or when she's afraid I'll die." The words were matter of fact, not dramatic. Not sad, just the kind of truth that's been rehearsed in silence too many times. Frank swallowed and stood up, moving toward the kettle. She didn't used to be quiet, Sura added, voice quieter now. She used to laugh. Not loud, but real. What changed? Sura hesitated. Then the camps and the burning. Frank stopped mid-reach. She didn't explain. Didn't need to. He'd heard rumors, whispers traded in low voices over fence posts and water rations. Stories of alien families locked behind improvised barriers, kept out of human settlements in the name of resource protection. Fires that started on accident, or on purpose. No one ever knew for sure. Most settlers didn't ask questions. Frank had stopped asking a long time ago. But now, maybe he shouldn't have. Behind them, Aniva stirred again, this time louder. A choked breath, a faint groan. Sura dropped the charcoal. She ran to the cot, climbing up beside her mother in one quick motion. Her small fingers touched Aniva's face gently, brushing a few strands of white hair away. Frank moved closer, slowly, and watched as Aniva's eyes blinked open. She looked groggy, disoriented, her breath uneven, but she was awake and conscious. Sura smiled. You stayed. Aniva's voice was sandpaper. I always stay. Frank brought a small tin cup of warm water and offered it without a word. Aniva took it with trembling hands. She drank slowly. Her lips parted like she wanted to speak, but instead she closed her eyes and let the warmth settle in her throat. You're safe here, Frank said. Aniva's eyes opened again. Safe doesn't exist. It does. It's just rare. She looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable in her expression. Not distrust, not gratitude either. Something more complicated, like recognition. You don't flinch, she said, when you look at us. Should I? You're human. So are most of the bastards who made you run. Aniva's mouth curved, just barely, into something between amusement and contempt. Sura tugged at her mother's hand. Mama, I ate real stew last night. Warm stew. Aniva blinked at her. You didn't wait? She said I could, Frank offered. She still asked. She's careful, Aniva whispered. I taught her that. Sura glanced between them, then hopped off the cot. Can I draw more? Use the wall I haven't patched, Frank said, gesturing. That side over there. Plenty of space. Sura skipped across the room, leaving her mother and Frank in heavy silence. Aniva didn't speak right away. When she did, her voice was distant. We weren't always wanderers. We had a city once. Oceans that glowed with life. Trees that whispered back when you sang to them. Now we sleep on rock and try not to dream. What happened? Colonial rerouting. Mining rights. The treaties broke before we knew they'd been signed. You fought. We ran. Frank studied her face. Her skin was still too pale. Her shoulders still drawn in too tightly. But she was here. She was trying. And for someone who'd seen their world collapse, that counted for something. He stood. There's tea in the cupboard. Dry but decent. I'll make some. She didn't stop him. But just as he turned away, she said, Frank. He looked back. Aniva's eyes had lost their hardness. Just for a second. Thank you for not asking if we deserved it. Frank gave a small nod. No one ever deserves to starve. Sura let out a delighted noise from across the room. Mama, I drew your song. Aniva's breath caught. Frank glanced toward the wall. A sweeping pattern danced across it. Long curves like sound waves, stars woven into spirals. At the center, a figure stood with her mouth open, and the sky around her lit up. He looked back at Aniva. She was crying, but no sound came. And maybe that was the first real truth they'd shared. Not survival, not duty, but a silence that finally had someone listening. The stars over Calhoun, 3 were dim that night, blurred behind a faint orange veil of dust. The winds had quieted, but the land still trembled under its own silence, like something grieving without sound. Inside the cabin, all the lamps were out, save for a small flickering unit near the cot. Its soft glow cast long shadows on the walls, illuminating faint traces of cold drawings and the shape of a child curled on a faded blanket. Aniva wasn't sleeping. She sat on the edge of the cot, her injured leg wrapped in a fresh cloth Frank had secured earlier that day. Her long white hair, cascading over one shoulder. Her violet-green skin looked ghostly under the yellow light, and her fingers trembled as they laced together in her lap. She stared not at her daughter, but at the window, where the glass had fogged from the warmth inside and the bitter cold just beyond it. Frank stood by the counter, silent, his arms crossed loosely over his chest. He'd been watching her for a while now, not with suspicion, but with something else. A question he hadn't asked yet, because he wasn't sure if the answer would wound her or him. Finally, she spoke. Her voice didn't shake. It was quiet but full. "You want to know where we came from?" Frank didn't deny it. Aniva turned her head, the motion slow and deliberate, until her gaze met his. "We weren't supposed to end up like this," she said. "Not me. Not her." Frank stepped forward, not close enough to crowd her, but just near enough to show he was listening. "I was a physician," she said. "On Drekka, our third moon. It wasn't rich, but it was green. Lush valleys, ocean winds. We lived simply, and that was enough. I treated children mostly. Midwife work, bone breaks, malaria strains. I used to make mothers laugh when they thought they'd break during labor. They call me Star Ants." Frank raised an eyebrow. Aniva gave a dry smile. "We believe that those born under the equinox convergence had stronger gifts. Healers, usually. I was born on the line, so they gave me the name. I didn't argue." She paused, looking back at the fogged window. Then the resource treaties were redrawn. Mining rights were bought out under our feet. Our moon was reclassified as extractable territory. No appeal. No negotiation. We were told the ecosystem couldn't be preserved alongside the lines. Frank didn't speak. He didn't need to. They gave us a transport date, a window to evacuate. My husband, Tehran, refused to leave. He believed we could resist peacefully. I begged him to come. He kissed our daughter and told her, "I'll catch up. I promise." Aniva's voice dropped. "She still asks when." Frank's jaw tightened. They cleared the settlement in one sweep. They didn't use weapons, not the way you'd think. They rerouted the water lines, shut down all solar access, then dropped a toxin into the lower farms, something that targeted photosynthetic bacteria. Within weeks, the valley died. Tehran stayed until his lungs began to bleed. I don't know what finally killed him. I just know we weren't there to see it. She let out a slow breath, as if the act of telling had cost her something physical. "I never told her he's dead," she whispered. "I wanted to believe he might show up. I needed something to believe in. But that hope started to rot inside me, like leaving food too long in the sun." Frank pulled out a chair and sat beside her. "You did what you had to. For her." "No," Aniva shook her head, her eyes hardening. "I did what I had to for myself. I left my people behind. I abandoned patients who couldn't walk, mothers in late pregnancy. I convinced myself I'd go back, that I was just getting Sura to safety. And you didn't. How could I?" Once we reached the transport zone, the camps were sealed. We became unauthorized civilians. You know what that means. He did. He remembered the phrasing in the reports. Unoffs, aliens without clearance, were marked as liabilities, not people. Dangerous by nature of existence. I lost my credentials, my name, everything. I became something that children cried at, something soldiers spat near. The only thing I never lost was her. She turned to look at Sura now, fast asleep, her small body curled against the faded blanket, a faint trail of charcoal dust still clinging to her fingers. "I taught her how to survive," Aniva said. "How to stay quiet. How to watch and not be seen. How to run when it's time. But I don't know how to teach her how to stop running." Frank sat with that for a long while. He thought of his own daughter, the weight of her absence, and the silence that came afterward. The quiet house, the meals that went uneaten, the days that bled together until he stopped counting. "I had a daughter too," he said, finally. "Her name was Mela. She got sick. Colony med teams wouldn't fly out this far. Said it wasn't priority jurisdiction. I buried her under the red tree past the southern ridge." Aniva turned toward him slowly, eyes wide and unreadable. "That's why you let us stay," she said. "No," Frank replied. "I let you stay because it was right. But I knew what it felt like to hold someone small and wonder if the world would let them live." Aniva didn't respond. She only looked down at her lap, hands resting loosely together, skin glowing faintly in the soft light. The room sat quiet again, but it wasn't the same silence. It was a silence that had shed something. Trust. Not full, but cracked open just enough. Then came a sound. Outside. Low. Distant. Rhythmic. Footsteps. Aniva stiffened. Frank stood quickly and moved toward the door, grabbing the old hunting lantern by the wall. He opened the hatch and stepped out into the night air, eyes sweeping across the dusty path toward the edge of the field. No one. Then he heard it again. Not footsteps. Wheezing. Soft and broken. A shadow moved near the fence. Small. Limping. A child. Frank's voice came out low. Someone's here. Aniva had already risen, limping toward the door, her injured leg dragging behind her, one hand braced against the wall. She reached the door and looked past him. Her eyes widened. "Kaylee," she breathed. "You know them? She's from Sector 13, one of the burn zone kids. We haven't seen her in weeks." The girl collapsed against the post near the greenhouse. Her skin, pale blue, like Sura's, was blistered, dry and splitting at the edges. She was clutching her stomach with one arm, her eyes glassy. Aniva didn't wait. Before Frank could stop her, she pushed past him into the night. Her gait was uneven, but she moved with purpose, across the yard, through the field, and down to the girl's side. Frank followed with the lantern, the beam cutting through the darkness. Aniva was already kneeling, murmuring softly in a language he didn't recognize. She checked the girl's pulse, touched her cheek, and lifted her into her arms with the kind of care that only came from practice and love. "She's burning up," Aniva said as Frank approached, "and dehydrated. I need clean water. Cloth. Something to stabilize her core temp." Frank didn't ask questions. He simply nodded and ran. Inside the cabin, Sura sat up, confused and blinking. "Who's that?" she asked. Frank gathered supplies in silence. "Another one who needs help." He returned outside to find Aniva seated on the earth, the child in her lap. Her face was set in a mask of focus, but her hands were trembling from fatigue. Frank knelt beside her, handed her a wet cloth. "You shouldn't have come out here like that," he said, voice quiet. "I could not come," she replied. And in that moment, he understood something else. Aniva hadn't just been a healer. She still was. She just hadn't been given the right to be one. Until now. As she wrapped the girl's hands and whispered a lullaby in a voice that trembled but didn't break, Frank sat beside her, shoulder to shoulder, and watched the night settle around them. It wasn't safety, but it was something close to sanctuary. And maybe for the first time in a long time, they'd found the beginning of something neither of them had known they still believed in. A future. The morning sun filtered through a broken cloud line, casting long, honey-colored streaks across the hard-packed soil behind the cabin. For once, the air wasn't choking with dust. It had rained overnight, barely more than a drizzle, but enough to darken the ground and bring out the deep, ancient scent of wet rock and dry roots. Calhoun 3 never stayed soft for long, but this morning it was breathing. Inside the cabin, everything felt slower, quieter. Kaylee lay sleeping on a makeshift cot Frank had rigged the night before. 2 crates bolted together, topped with thick blankets and an old sleeping pad. Her fever had broken. Her lips, once cracked and grayish blue, had regained color. The blotches on her arms had faded to pale rings. And her breathing, shallow but steady, was the kind of sound you didn't know you were waiting for until it filled a room. Aniva sat close by, her back resting against the wall, arms crossed over her chest, leg propped with a folded tarp beneath it. She hadn't moved much since dawn. Her expression was unreadable, not weary, not entirely calm either. Guarded, not in defense of herself, but of something more fragile, something she'd almost lost again. Frank watched her from across the room as he cleaned the same ceramic mug for the 3rd time. He wasn't sure why he kept scrubbing it. It was already clean, but the act kept his hands busy while his mind caught up to everything that had changed in just a few days. Sura had been up since early morning. She found a bundle of wind-dried grass behind the greenhouse and had spent the last half hour weaving the strands into a thin, lopsided circle. Her legs were folded beneath her, her elbows resting on the bench, and her eyes were locked in intense concentration. Frank walked past her and tilted his head. That's supposed to be a trap? It's a crown, she said without looking up. For Kaylee, she's a survivor now. She should have something royal. He smirked faintly. This one's your greenhouse too now, you know. She stepped forward slowly, favoring her bad leg. When she reached the entrance, she ran her fingers along the edge of the solar panel, gingerly, as though it might remember her touch. This smell, she murmured. It's the same as back home. Not the plants, those are different, but the air. When it's moist, when something's just started to grow. Frank offered her a small garden spade. You remember how to use one of these? She took it wordlessly. They worked together in near silence, pulling weeds, turning the earth. He didn't ask questions, and she didn't explain. But the rhythm formed between them, unspoken. Frank noticed she still hesitated before reaching into the soil, as if asking the dirt for permission. But after the second row, her hands moved faster. With purpose. She still had the instincts of a healer. At one point, their fingers brushed while reaching for the same sprout. Neither of them pulled back. No, she said. It's the first time we've unpacked something. Not because we were tired, but because we meant to stay. Sura crawled onto the mattress, bounced once, then flopped beside Kaylee with a grin. This is our house now, she declared. You have to call us the Garden Girls. Frank raised an eyebrow. Garden Girls? Because we grow things, Sura said, even when the ground says we can't. Outside, the last light of the sun melted behind the ridge. Inside, the air was warm with something new. Not just safety, belonging. And in that fragile, flickering peace, something ancient stirred beneath the soil. Not fear, not shame, roots. By the 23rd day, the wind had calmed. The endless drone of dry gusts, once a constant presence around Frank's cabin, had softened to nothing more than the occasional sigh through the cracked boards of the porch. The silence wasn't eerie anymore. It felt earned, like a storm that had passed and left the air gentler in its wake. It's being seen and still allowed to stay. A cloud of dust stirred on the road. The crawler appeared like a beast rising from beneath the horizon, gray, low-bodied, humming with silent power. It moved slowly, deliberately, like it already knew the exact number of steps left in this story. Sura saw it first. They're here. No one moved. No one ran. Kaylee came to stand beside Aniva, her small hand curling into her mother's. Sura joined her, slipping one arm around Frank's leg like she might anchor him in place. The crawler stopped. Two patrol officers stepped out. One was Sergeant Kelmar again, visor dark, posture tight. The other was new, a woman with the hard shoulders of a veteran and the gaze of someone who didn't believe in second chances. Frank walked out to meet them halfway, arms loose at his sides. Kelmar spoke first. Your 30 days are over, Hale. Frank said nothing. The female officer stepped forward. We've reviewed your claim. Frank dropped down from the roof with a practiced thud and walked around to the front, his body tense. There, just beyond the low slope where the dry path dipped out of sight, came a transport crawler. Its paint was chipped, the surface dulled by grit, but the black and white markings on the side were unmistakable. Terran Resettlement Patrol. Frank's breath slowed. Not from fear. He'd dealt with patrols before. But not like this. Not now. The crawler rolled to a stop just outside the boundary of his property. No alarms. No weapons drawn. Just two officers in neutral armor stepping out. One tall, one compact, both wearing visors. Frank didn't wait for them to knock. He opened the door and stepped outside, wiping his hands on a cloth as if they were just any other visitors. Something I can help you with? He asked, keeping his voice steady. The taller officer, badge reading Sergeant Kelmar, nodded curtly. Routine passed through. He hadn't spoken in a while. He rarely did unless there was something worth saying. But tonight, she could feel the words sitting behind his silence, pressing against the weight of their shared quiet. You haven't asked me what happens after 30 days, he said finally. She looked at him. I assumed you'd tell me when it mattered. Frank turned the mug in his hands. I have a contact, a supply handler out in Sector 4. Owes me a favor. Might be able to forge transit IDs, maybe register Kaylee and Sura under a Frontier Family Protection Clause. And me, his jaw tightened. You would still be flagged. A repeat boundary violator. Aniva nodded slowly. She wasn't surprised. But if I say we're bonded, he added, more quietly, they might not look too closely. She turned to face him fully now. Her voice was soft but steady. And are we? Frank met her gaze. I think we could be, if we chose to be. A moment passed between them, thick, quiet, full. Inside, the home felt different too. The extra bed they'd built together didn't look new anymore. Its blankets were mussed and creased. A half-finished scarf lay tossed across the corner. Coal drawings on the wall had multiplied, Sura and Kaylee's doing. One was a clumsy rendering of the cabin, another of the greenhouse. And in the corner, faint but unmistakable, a crooked crown and four stick figures, all holding hands. Family. They hadn't said the word aloud. Not yet, but it hovered in the space between them now, like something waiting to be claimed. Aniva sat on the porch steps that evening, a warm cup nestled in her hands. The sky was deep violet, tinged orange where the sun dipped beneath the dust ridge. Her silver-white hair was pulled into a low braid, strands loose around her face. Her leg, still sore but healing, was stretched out in front of her, the blanket around her shoulders slipping slightly with the breeze. Frank sat beside her, arms resting on his knees. But they breathed easier. Inside, two small voices echoed down the hallway. Kaylee, Sura whispered from their shared bed. I think Mama kissed Mr. Frank. Kaylee gasped theatrically. Did she really? I heard a smooch. I think that's the sound. Kaylee giggled. Does that mean he's ours now? I think it means we're all each other's now. They both broke into hushed giggles, hiding under the blanket. Outside, Aniva laid her head gently against Frank's shoulder. They're listening. I know. They'll ask questions in the morning. I'll have answers. She tilted her face toward him again, just enough to see his expression. Are you ready for that? Frank nodded. I want it all, even the questions. The next day passed in sun-warmed peace. They worked together, Frank tightening panels on the greenhouse, Aniva preparing dried herbs for infusion. The sector's barely staffed as it is. If they're not on the camp manifest, they're not our burden, yet. Kelmar gave one last look around, then turned toward the door. 30 days, he said flatly. That's all you get. Understood, Frank replied. And just like that, the patrol was gone. The crawler rolled back into the horizon, its tires kicking up thin streaks of sand that disappeared as quickly as they came. Back inside, no one spoke for several seconds. Then Sura burst out. You said we're yours now. Frank turned toward her. I did. Aniva's voice trembled, not with fear, but with something older than hope. Why would you risk that? Frank took a deep breath. Because this place was quiet, he said, but it was never alive. Not until you walked through that field. Aniva's hand found the edge of the table. She gripped it as if bracing against something bigger than gravity. Her voice came out almost a whisper. You're not afraid? I am, he said honestly. They're not running, Frank continued. And neither am I. A silence stretched. Then Aniva spoke, her voice even full. You can arrest me. You can log your report and check your boxes. But the story won't end there. Because one of these girls is going to grow up and tell the truth. That she was worth more than a barcode. That she was loved. Kaylee stepped forward. I'm not sick anymore. Sura nodded. And I planted a flower. And it didn't die. Kelmar looked at them. Then at Frank. Then down at the scanner in his hand. He sighed. Technically, he muttered, Section 12B allows a retroactive claim if a citizen can prove cohabitation and shared guardianship over 30 standard days. His partner's head snapped toward him. Sergeant. He cut her off. Frank Hale is a decorated terraformer. 8 years in Sector Red. 2 commendations for community stability. His record is clean. He looked up. And if he says this is his family, I'm inclined to let that stand. Aniva looked back toward the horizon. I haven't chosen anyone in a long time. I stopped believing I deserved to. You didn't stop believing, Frank said. You were just too busy surviving. He shifted a little closer. Their shoulders nearly touched. She didn't move away. You're not just safe here, Aniva, he said, voice low. You're wanted. She turned her head slowly, her eyes shimmering in the half-light. Frank, but he didn't let her finish. I don't need you to say it, he whispered. I just need to know if I can. Yes. The word left her mouth before her mind could interrupt it. And then she leaned forward, slowly, deliberately, and pressed her lips to his. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't desperate. It was the kind of kiss that carried weight, not heat. The kind that says we are still here, even after all that try to break us. His hand found hers, fingers threading together without effort. When they parted, she didn't move away. Neither of them smiled. Her eyes closed for a breath. Then she ate, not out of appetite, but out of something closer to ritual. They ate together in silence. Not awkward, not strained, just careful. Like people learning to be near one another without bracing for pain. After the bowls were cleaned and the fire reduced to embers, Frank stepped outside to tend to the greenhouse. The soil was finally soft enough to turn. He moved down the row, checking the reflective panels, brushing debris from the ventilation slats, hands automatically performing a routine older than the colony itself. Behind him, he heard footsteps, light, hesitant. He didn't turn until she spoke. I can walk, Aniva said, her voice low. But not for long. Frank turned to find her standing in the doorway, barefoot, wrapped in one of his old blankets. Her hair, though still unbrushed, had been pulled back. The silver lines along her cheeks caught the light again, faint but no longer dim. Come in, he said, nodding toward the path. And in that small patch of scorched soil, where nothing was supposed to grow, something did. By the time the midday heat settled in, the sky had turned a hard, pale white. It wasn't quite the same as the harsh red of the dust storms, but it carried a different kind of threat, stillness. On Calhoun 3, quiet was never just quiet. It was a warning. Frank stood on the roof of his cabin, adjusting one of the solar collectors that had been knocked out of alignment in last week's wind. Sweat trickled down his temple, disappearing into the coarse stubble along his jaw. He could hear the girls inside, Sura's high-pitched voice explaining something to Kaylee, who responded in broken whispers, still too weak to raise her volume. The sound of their chatter drifted through the open window like something fragile and precious. And then he heard something else. Wheels, not from a supply drone. These were larger, heavier, tires grinding slowly through dust, like an animal recognizing the scent of a predator. Frank stepped in just ahead of the patrol. His eyes met Aniva's for the briefest second, and in that instant, something passed between them. Not panic, agreement. Kelmar walked through the cabin slowly. His partner followed, scanning walls, shelves, even the floor. Kaylee didn't move. Neither did Sura. Aniva's hand hovered near the knife she had been using, but she didn't pick it up. She didn't run. She didn't speak. They had run before. Hidden, evaded. But not this time. The sergeant's gaze swept the room. You live here alone, Hale? Not anymore, Frank said. Kelmar turned. Is that so? I've taken in 2 dependents. Off-grid miners. No violations. Section 8B of the Colonization Compact allows me to house unauthorized persons under emergency status for 30 standard days. Kelmar's lips pressed into a hard line. And you're claiming these refugees under that status? I'm not claiming them, Frank said. But I've been afraid before. And I was alone then. They stood in that quiet. Kaylee watching, Sura wide-eyed, Aniva motionless. Then slowly, Aniva walked to him, each step deliberate. Her limp still noticeable, but no longer a hindrance. She reached up and placed her hand over his chest. I don't want to be a guest, she said. Not anymore. He didn't smile, but he covered her hand with his own. Then don't be. That night, Frank built a second bed. Not a cot, not a temporary nest of blankets. A real bed. Sura helped him place the wood panels, handed him nails and screws, asked 100 questions about how long it would last. A long time, he said. Forever. As long as we need it. Kaylee helped too, dragging over pillows and folding blankets. Aniva stood in the doorway watching them, arms folded but not closed off. She didn't say anything until the last screw was in place. Then she whispered, "Thank you." Frank looked over at her. It's just a bed. She turned to him fully, and for the first time, she smiled without restraint. A smile not of survival, but of choice, of wanting. And far behind them, under the soil of a battered world, roots dug just a little deeper. Because love wasn't just the reason they stayed. It was the reason they wouldn't leave again. The morning of the 30th day began in stillness. No wind, no sand scraping against the windows, just the faint sound of breathing, slow and steady, from the sleeping figures inside the cabin. Frank rose early, before the girls stirred. He dressed quietly, pulling on the same weather-worn boots he had every morning for years, but today they felt different. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the sky shift from muted blue to soft lavender. The sun hadn't yet crested the ridge, but the land was already awake, waiting. Behind him, a quiet rustle. Aniva stood near the bed, her white hair braided loosely down her back. No legal guardianship was filed, no family bond certification, no refugee integration documentation. You've harbored fugitives past the allotted amnesty period. She opened a portable scanner. We have the right to retrieve all unauthorized beings and detain you pending further disciplinary review. Frank didn't flinch. You could try. The woman raised her brows. That a threat, citizen? It's a truth, he said calmly. They're not fugitives anymore. They're my family. And if you take them, you'd better bring a damn good reason to explain to this land why you ripped apart what it finally let grow. Kelmar's jaw shifted. The female officer blinked. The law was written by people who never touched this soil, Frank said, who never lost a child in it, who never watched someone plant something fragile and wait weeks just to see it breathe. He turned slightly, motioning toward the cabin. Aniva stepped out, the girls flanking her like sentinels. Later, under a quiet sky, Aniva and Frank sat beneath the greenhouse archway, watching the night bloom above them. We're not just surviving anymore, she said. No, he replied. Now we're growing. And far beneath the soil of Calhoun 3, where no one thought life could take root, something did. It bloomed, and it stayed. And what do royalty eat for breakfast? Stew, Sura replied with total seriousness. But only if it's spicy and smells like home. Frank went back to the stove, stirred the pot slowly, and tasted the broth. He added a pinch more salt from a chipped tin, then looked over at Aniva. You hungry? She didn't respond immediately. She'd been like that more often, there but distant, present yet tightly coiled. Sura looked up. She'll eat after Kaylee does. Mama says food tastes better once you know your child's okay. Frank ladled out 2 bowls anyway. He placed one next to Aniva and held the other towards Sura. She's better now, he said. So both of you are allowed to eat. Sura took the bowl without protest and carried it to Kaylee, setting it down near the cot and crouching beside it. I'll help her sit when she wakes up. Aniva's hand hovered over her own bowl for a moment. Then she slowly wrapped her fingers around it, exhaling quietly as the steam touched her face. No, Sura said with exaggerated solemnity. You get stew, and you get to stay. Frank leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, watching the 3 of them. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Later that evening, after Kaylee had fallen back asleep and the sun had dipped behind the hills, Aniva stood beside Frank in the garden. Sura was digging in the soft earth, planting a single scrappy-looking seed. She pressed the soil around it carefully, then whispered something only the dirt could hear. What's she doing? Aniva asked. Frank smiled faintly. She says it's a stomach flower, one that grows only when someone's really loved. Those don't exist, Aniva said, shaking her head. Not yet, he replied, but she's trying anyway. Aniva looked down, watching her daughter press her palms to the ground as if it would make the seed take root faster. Then, without thinking, she reached for Frank's hand. He didn't flinch. She didn't let go. I'm protecting them. A beat passed. The silence thickened. Outside, the wind had picked up again, brushing loose sand against the windows. Kelmar tilted his head. You know what the penalty is for harboring fugitives past the 30-day threshold? Frank's face was calm. I do. Aniva stepped forward then. Just one step. Just enough to place herself beside Frank. Her voice was clear. If you need to arrest someone, arrest me. I crossed into the settlement boundary. I took food. I didn't ask for mercy. Sura started to rise, but Kaylee held her back gently. Kelmar looked between them, then to Frank. And this one, She's a child, Frank said. She's under my care now. Both of them are. Kelmar's eyes narrowed. You're not military. You're not authorized for guardianship. Frank stepped forward, just slightly. Under this roof, he said, I make the rules. The sergeant stared at him for a long moment. His partner finally spoke, quietly. We're stretched thin. Sura and Kaylee gathered small stones from around the house, declaring them wish rocks, and placing them in a circle beneath the violet flame bloom that had survived Sura's hopeful planting. When the 30 days are over, Sura explained to Kaylee, we'll each make one wish. What will you wish for? Sura tilted her head thoughtfully. I don't think I'll tell you. Wishes don't like to be overheard. Kaylee giggled. I'm going to wish Mama marries Frank. Sura shrugged. That's not even a wish. That's just obvious. That night, after supper, Aniva lit a small lantern and set it near the plant bed outside. Frank watched her from the window, arms crossed over his chest. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, her hair glowing orange in the firelight, the night whispering around her like a song. Then she looked back at him and said softly, one more day. Frank opened the door and stepped out. No, he said, just one more chapter. The other officer stared at him, incredulous. But she didn't object. Not out loud. Kelmar nodded. You won't hear from us again. Then he turned, walked back to the crawler, and drove away. The dust settled behind them like a curtain falling at the end of a long performance. And just like that, it was over. No applause. No explosion. No final stand. Just peace. Just choice. Aniva let out a long, uneven breath. Frank reached for her hand. This time, she didn't just take it. She held on. That night, they celebrated, not with noise, but with stillness and warmth. Aniva lit a low flame in the fireplace, and Frank cooked a stew so rich the girls claimed it must have been magic. They danced, awkward and barefoot, to the sound of wind chimes swaying outside the door. Kaylee wore her flower crown again. Sura added more drawings to the walls. One showed 4 figures standing beneath a tree with deep roots and wide branches, cradling stars in their arms. There was a motion ping last night near the South Ridge. Thermal signature matched a humanoid form entering a private zone. Frank shrugged. Probably a coyote. They come down for the compost sometimes. Kelmar didn't react. Private zones are not designated for wildlife. Frank crossed his arms. Neither are most of the camps. The sergeant's partner shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Kelmar stepped closer. We have orders to scan any residences within a 3-mile radius. Nothing invasive. Standard compliance. Shouldn't take more than a few minutes. Frank didn't blink. You won't find anything here. Then you won't mind. Frank opened the door without hesitation. Go ahead. Just don't touch the greenhouse. Inside, Aniva froze mid-step. She had been slicing dried root stalks into stew and placing them neatly into the pot. Kaylee and Sura sat at the far corner of the room with small cups in their hands. The moment the boots hit the porch, the air shifted. Aniva's eyes met his. And this time, she didn't look away. I forgot what this felt like, she said softly. To be useful. To not be hiding. Frank adjusted a cracked reflector and looked up at her. You were never just hiding. You were surviving. There's a difference. Maybe, she said, but they don't build statues for survivors. No, Frank replied. They build families. She froze, not startled, just still. And then, from the distance, a voice. Mama. Kaylee's awake. Aniva dropped the spade without a word and moved toward the cabin. She didn't run. Her leg wouldn't allow it. But every part of her posture screamed urgency. Frank followed. Inside, Kaylee was sitting upright, blinking slowly, her mouth dry but smiling. You came back, she whispered. Aniva knelt beside her, brushing her hair back gently. I always do. Sura placed the grass crown gently on Kaylee's head. Now you're a queen. Kaylee giggled weakly. Does that mean I get castle? She wore one of his old flannel shirts over her tunic, sleeves rolled to her elbows. There was no fear in her eyes this morning. No guilt, only resolve. They'll come today, she said. He nodded. Do you think he'll take us? Frank turned to her. Not if I have anything to say about it. Down the hall, Kaylee and Sura had already begun to whisper. They weren't afraid. either. They were hatching a plan to hide in the root cellar with their emergency snacks and a pair of sticks they had declared honorary swords. Frank overheard Kaylee whisper, "If they take Mama, we'll make them regret it." He almost smiled. Aniva joined him on the porch, watching the horizon with the kind of stillness only someone who had been hunted before could carry. But today, she wasn't hiding. "I used to think being free meant disappearing," she said. "Becoming untraceable, unnoticed." She looked at him now. "But it doesn't, does it?" Frank shook his head. "Freedom isn't being invisible.